Okay, so imagine this. You're living the good life, right? Successful, it's got people who love you, maybe even feeling kind of blessed. Then bam, everything you know falls apart, vanishes. What do you hold on to? That's the heavy stuff we're digging into today, unpacking the book of Job, this tale of faith and suffering that never gets old.
It's a story that's echoed for centuries, and for good reason. Job's experience, it's like it cuts right to the core of what it means to be human. It makes us face those big, uncomfortable questions about why bad things happen.
And you know me, I'm all about confronting those tough questions. We've got some really insightful material to work with here, including these sermon notes that connect Job's ancient story to our modern lives. But first, we've got to set the scene. Who is Job?
Well, the text portrays him as this really righteous guy, describes him as blameless and upright.
Right.
Picture someone who's killing it. Wealth, family, everything. He's the guy everyone thinks has life all figured out.
Okay, so we've got Mr. Perfect over here, but then it all goes sideways, right?
And I mean everything. He loses his possessions, his kids, his health. We're talking a level of devastation most of us can't even wrap our heads around.
It's interesting, though, because his first reaction isn't what you'd expect. He tears his clothes, shaves his head, falls to the ground, but it's an act of worship.
No.
Then he says these powerful words the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Now that statement right there, that's the heart of it all. Job, in the middle of unimaginable suffering, acknowledges God's sovereignty, which, can sound kind of old-fashioned, but basically it means God has total power over everything, even suffering.
Wow, you just kind of blew my mind. To go through that kind of loss and still praise, it's a lot to process. What's the deeper meaning there? What does it tell us about Job?
It shows a depth of faith that goes beyond logic. He's not pretending to have the answers. He's not shaking his fist at the sky. Instead, he recognizes there's a power greater than him, and he chooses to hold on to his faith even when it feels impossible.
So it's not about understanding why in that moment of pain. It's about clinging to that faith, like
Yeah.
a reflex, right?
Yeah,
When everything else is gone, that belief is what's left.
exactly. And that brings us to the central question in the book of Job. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries.
And let's be real, it's a question we're still wrestling with today. It feels almost instinctive to want to find a reason, a cause and effect. Like if someone's suffering, they must have done something to deserve it.
Absolutely. And that's where Job's friends come in. They represent that very human response to suffering. They
Yeah.
embody that ancient belief that if you're prosperous, you must be righteous. It's easier to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people because it gives us this feeling of control, of order. But the text, it challenges this simplistic view.
It's like in Job 24.1, where Job himself points out that wicked people often prosper while good people suffer. It's this blatant contradiction that makes you question everything.
Exactly. Job's story throws a wrench in that whole prosperity gospel thing.
Right.
It forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that life isn't always fair. There isn't always a direct connection between what we do and what happens to us.
So where does that leave someone like Job then? He's wrestling with this idea of God's sovereignty, God being in control even in suffering. But he doesn't understand why. What happens next?
That's where the story takes this really interesting turn. Job isn't content with blind faith, with just accepting his fate. He craves understanding. He wants a real encounter with God, where he can directly question and grapple with his situation.
He's not looking for cliches or easy answers. He wants to understand why.
Exactly. He wants to make his case to have this real back and forth with God, and this desire to wrestle with the unknown, to search for meaning in suffering. I think that really resonates with everyone. It's that universal search for meaning that goes beyond time and culture.
So it's not just about enduring suffering. It's about actively struggling with it, questioning it, even challenging it.
Exactly. And that act of wrestling with our faith, with the big questions of life and death, that's often where we grow, even in the midst of pain. And, that connects directly to one of the key themes in these sermon notes, the importance of responding to suffering with empathy instead of judgment. Because let's be honest, it's much easier to judge someone else's pain than to sit with them in it.
Absolutely. Job's friends, bless their hearts.
Yeah.
They really missed the mark on that one.
Oh, they really did. They were so quick to assume that Job must have done something to deserve his suffering. But as we said before, that whole prosperity equals righteousness idea, it's a dangerous oversimplification. It's a way of distancing ourselves from another person's pain, to protect ourselves from the discomfort of not having answers.
It's like we'd rather judge than admit that sometimes bad things happen to good people and there's no reason or explanation that makes sense.
Exactly. And that's where empathy comes in. It's about recognizing that we don't always need to understand someone's experience to offer support and compassion. It's about resisting that urge to judge, to give advice that's not wanted, or to try and fix their pain. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just listen, to be there with someone in their suffering.
Which, let's be honest, is way harder than it sounds.
Mm.
It's so much easier to offer platitudes or try to distract someone from their pain than to actually sit with them in it.
You're absolutely right. It takes courage and vulnerability to truly empathize with someone who's hurting. And it means we have to confront our own discomfort with suffering, our own fear of being vulnerable.
It's about recognizing that suffering, it's a universal human experience. And in that shared vulnerability, there's incredible strength and the potential for a really deep connection. And isn't that what these sermon notes are getting at? That Job's story, even though it's ancient, it gives us this blueprint for how to navigate suffering, both our own and other people's wholes, with more compassion, more empathy, and ultimately more grace.
Exactly. It's about shifting from judgment to understanding. Instead of asking, what did you do to deserve this? Maybe we ask, how can I support you through this?
That's a powerful shift in thinking. It reminds me of the next application point, avoiding hasty judgment and fostering a culture of understanding and support. It's about realizing we rarely have the full picture of what someone else is going through. So approaching their pain with humility and compassion is key.
And that connects to the third point from the sermon notes, finding ways to worship even through pain. It's about recognizing that worship isn't always about joyful singing and celebration. Sometimes it's about giving our pain, our confusion, our anger to something bigger than ourselves.
It makes me picture Job tearing his clothes, shaving his head, falling down in worship. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it was real.
And that's what matters, right? Authenticity. True worship comes from a place of honesty, even when it hurts.
You know, it's interesting. We talk about offering support instead of trying to fix things, but sometimes even just having faith can feel like a solution in itself. Like if you just believe hard enough, everything will be okay. But Job's story kind of throws a wrench in that, doesn't it?
For sure. Because having faith, especially when you're going through tough times, it's not about slapping on a happy face and pretending everything's fine. It's about holding on to that belief, that connection to something bigger than us, even when we're drowning in doubt and pain. And that's actually the first thing those sermon notes talk about, maintaining faith in difficult times.
Which, let's be real, is way easier said than done. I can think of times in my own life where grief or loss just completely blindsided me. And that urge to question everything, even my faith, was so strong.
Of course, it's a totally natural human response. But just like Job found a way to worship even in his darkest moments, so can we. And that doesn't have to mean putting on a suit and going to church. It could be something as simple as taking a moment of quiet reflection, being thankful for the good things we still have, or even just acknowledging the pain and offering it up to something bigger than ourselves.
It's about finding that anchor, that source of strength, even in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. And you know, it's interesting, Job's story doesn't shy away from those raw, messy emotions that come with suffering. It actually encourages us to lean into them.
Which brings us to the fifth point about talking to God or whatever higher power you connect with about our struggles. This one really hit home for me.
It's about recognizing that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask the tough questions, to wrestle with doubt and uncertainty. And Job, even when he's railing against the unfairness of it all, he's still looking for that connection, that dialogue with the divine.
It's like in those verses where he talks about wanting to plead his case to God. He's hurting, he's confused, but he still wants that connection.
Exactly. It's not about pretending or suppressing our doubts, but bringing them to the surface, having an honest, vulnerable conversation. And that kind of authenticity, that willingness to be real with ourselves and our faith, that's where true growth and understanding can happen.
You know, it's interesting how that whole idea of authentic dialogue ties into the second point, responding to others' suffering with empathy instead of judgment. Job's friends, God bless them, they really dropped the ball on that one.
Oh, they did. They were so quick to assume that Job must have done something to deserve what happened. But like we talked about before, that prosperity equals righteousness thing, it's a dangerous oversimplification. It's a way to distance ourselves from somewhere else's pain, to protect ourselves from that feeling of not having answers.
It's like we'd rather judge than admit that sometimes bad things just happen. And there isn't always a reason why.
Exactly. And that's where empathy comes in. It's about realizing that we don't have to understand what someone's going through to offer support and compassion. It's about resisting that urge to judge, to give advice when it's not asked for, or to try and fix their pain. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just listen. to truly be present with them in their
Which,
suffering.
let's be honest, is a lot harder than it sounds. It's
Mm.
way easier to just say empty words or try to distract someone from their pain than to actually sit with them in it.
You're absolutely right. It takes real courage and vulnerability to truly empathize with someone who's hurting. And it requires us to face our own discomfort with suffering, our own fear of vulnerability.
It's about recognizing that suffering, it's something we all experience. And in that shared vulnerability, there's incredible strength and a possibility for really deep connection. And isn't that really what these sermon notes are getting at? That Job story, even though it's ancient, it gives us this guide for how to deal with suffering, both our own and other people's was, with more compassion, more empathy, and in the end, more grace.
Precisely. It's about moving from judgment to understanding. Instead of, what did you do to deserve this? Maybe it's, how can I support you through this?
That's a powerful change in perspective. It reminds me of the next point, avoiding hasty judgment and fostering a culture of understanding and support.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we rarely have all the facts about what someone's going through. So approaching their pain with humility and compassion is so important.
And that ties into that third point from the sermon notes. Finding ways to worship even when we're hurting. It's about recognizing that worship isn't always about joyful singing and celebration. Sometimes it's about surrendering our pain, our confusion, our anger to something beyond ourselves.
It makes me think about that image of Job tearing his robe, shaving his head, falling down in worship. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it was real.
And that's what matters, isn't it? Authenticity, true worship. It has to come from a place of honesty, even when it's hard.
It's like instead of trying to hide or ignore the painful stuff, Job just leans right into it. It's
Yeah.
raw. It's real. And there's the surprising strength in that kind of vulnerability.
Absolutely. And that goes back to what you were saying before about finding that anchor for our faith, even in the middle of those tough times. Sometimes that anchor isn't about easy answers or some perfect faith. It's about showing up with all our messy, complicated selves and just saying, I'm here, even if I don't get it.
It's about accepting that life is messy, that there are questions without easy answers, and finding ways to support each other through it all, which actually reminds me of that fourth point we haven't talked about yet, engaging in a real conversation with God about our struggles.
And that one really gets at the core of Job's journey, wouldn't you say? He wasn't satisfied with just blindly believing, with just accepting his fate. He wanted to understand, to question, to plead his case directly to God.
He's not afraid to bring his anger, his doubt, his confusion to the table.
Yeah.
He's wrestling with God, not worshiping from this place of fear or obligation.
Exactly. And that's such a powerful message because it really challenges that traditional idea of prayer or worship being something that needs to be all pretty and put together. Job's story tells us it's okay to be real with God, to bring our whole selves to the table, even the parts that are hurting or mad.
It's about understanding that faith isn't about having it all figured out. It's about being brave enough to ask those tough questions. And to sit with them even if the answers don't come easily or when we want them to.
Which honestly can be really frustrating. I think we've all had those moments where we're practically yelling at the universe, come on, what's the deal here?
Oh yeah, for sure. I've had my fair share of those conversations. But there's something so freeing about knowing we can bring those raw, unfiltered emotions to our faith. It's not about pretending or putting on a show, but about showing up as we are, even when we're struggling.
Exactly. And it's in that real dialogue, that wrestling with God, that we often grow. And we start to understand ourselves and our place in the world a little better. It's not always easy or comfortable, but it's in those hard spaces where we tend to grow the most.
It makes you think about how differently we might approach suffering, both in our own lives and as a society, if we really took Job's story to heart.
That's a powerful thought. What if we could create places where it's okay to not be okay? Where people meet your vulnerability with compassion instead of judgment, and where we're encouraged to wrestle with those big questions instead of pretending to have all the answers.
It's about recognizing that suffering is something we all go through. And in that shared vulnerability, there's this incredible strength and potential for deep connection. Job's story, even though it's thousands of years old, it still resonates so much today because it speaks to these universal truths about what it means to be human.
And it reminds us that even when things are really rough, there's always hope. And I don't mean this naive, everything happens for a reason kind of hope, but a deeper, more lasting hope that comes from knowing we're not alone in our pain, that there's something bigger than us holding us even when we can't see it or feel it.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the book of Job, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. If Job were alive today walking among us, how do you think he'd react to all the suffering in the world? What would he challenge us to do differently?
And that's a powerful question.
Yeah.
And I think it's one each of us needs to really sit with. Because Job's story isn't just some ancient tale, it's a call to action, a call to embrace empathy, to wrestle with the tough stuff, and to show up authentically in the face of suffering, both our own and other people's.
It's about realizing that even in those really dark times, there's always a chance for growth, for connection, for our faith and our humanity to grow deeper. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Keep diving deep into the things that matter, and we'll catch you on the next episode.